Something painful, I am certain, has happened. Come, sit down on this rock, or shall we go yonder to our favorite oak? Raphael seated himself on the rock and turned his face from his friend. You have had something to grieve or to alarm you. The lad whom you visited is dead. He is better, the rossignol replied, but you feel dull and gloomy, as I felt yesterday. Such a cloud came over me then, it seemed as if everything were dark around. You cheered me then, Raphael. It is my turn to cheer you now. I have been forming such golden plans for the future, plans for you as well as for myself. And in a few rapid sentences, Horace described some of the hopes which had been brightening his solitary hours. Raphael only responded with a sigh so deep-drawn that Horace saw at once that no light trouble, no passing cloud could cast such a shadow on his soul. You have heard bad news, cried young Cleveland. Do they regard yourself or me? Raphael's silence was sufficient reply. Tell me the whole truth, exclaimed Horace. Could you bear it? Answered Raphael, slowly turning round and fixing his large dark eyes upon Horace with a gaze of unutterable sadness. Yes, I can bear all, must know all, exclaimed Horace. His heart was beginning to throb fast, while a sensation of cold crept over him, assuredly not caused by the weather. All is said in few words. Otto was hanged this morning. Prepared as he was for a painful communication, the tidings came upon Horace like a blow. He had been so full of hopeful anticipation, he had had such confidence in the power of his mother's tears and her gold, that he had little reckoned upon having to suffer anything beyond a 7 days' captivity. Now Matteo's horrible threat, that threat which he had not dared to translate to his mother, rose up in his mind like a specter. Are you quite certain that the tidings are true? Quite certain, was the mournful reply. Does Matteo know all? He can hardly know it, or I should not have found you here alone. But he will be sure to know it before the morning. Evil tidings fly on swift wings. Horace grasped the hand of his friend with a convulsive pressure. Oh, Raphael, you will not, cannot see me murdered in cold blood by that merciless man. For my mother's sake, for God's sake, for the sake of him whom you serve, release me, save me from this horrible fate. The earnest, imploring gaze was met by one of anguish. We can fly together, continued Horace, speaking with eager rapidity. Once out of the forest we are both safe, both happy. Raphael interrupted him with a single word, Enrico. In that name were expressed all the difficulties of his position, at least all such as might be regarded as insuperable. The fearful choice to Raphael lay but between his brother and his friend. To save the one was to sacrifice the other. It was a moment of exquisite pain to the captive and his companion. So great was the tension of their nerves that the sound of a whistle from below made them both start, as if it had been a death signal. They come, all is lost, exclaimed Horace. No, not so. There is but one man. It is only Marco, said Raphael, as the powerful form of the bandit appeared advancing to the rock. But he knows all. I see it in his face. "He comes a death messenger," cried Horace. And certainly the dark, saturnine countenance of the robber wore a deeper shade of gloom than usual, such as could not escape the notice of the anxious eyes that sought to read in it their fate. "He may know nothing. Do not betray your own secret," whispered Raphael, who, however, could not but draw the same conclusion as young Cleveland had done from the bandit's appearance. Chapter 15. Onwards. When Marco had reached the top of the parapet, Horace drew a little hope from the trivial circumstance that the bandit did not look at him, nor appear to notice his presence. He addressed himself at once to the improvisatory. "Your preaching to the living is over. You may now pray for the dead," he said in a hollow, sepulchral voice, crossing himself as he spoke. "Explain yourself," exclaimed Raphael. "Your brother is," Marco pointed downwards, "with the souls in purgatory." Raphael uttered an exclamation which was almost like a cry. "Not by violence, not by violence," he gasped forth. Marco gloomily shook his head and muttered between his teeth, "The Cascata della Morte." "How did it happen?" exclaimed Horace, giving voice to the question painted on Raphael's agonized face. "We were all on our way to the high road," said Marco, "when someone proposed that instead of following the bend of the river, it would be well for one or two of our party to cross it, so that by making a round to the left, we might come on the travelers from behind, while the rest attacked them in front. Enrico and I had orders to cross. You know," continued the robber, addressing himself to Raphael, "that the only bridge there is the trunk of the tree, thrown across from bank to bank, some 20 yards above the Cascata. Enrico went first. I lingered to tighten my belt, which was loose. I know not whether he was taken with giddiness at seeing the waters rushing on so madly beneath him, or whether he stumbled on the rough bark, but I saw Enrico suddenly go down splash into the current. He gave a cry and struggled desperately, but the rush there is so strong and rapid that no swimmer could stem it. The water bore him on as if he had been a reed on the surface, over. You know the depth of the fall, and may judge whether he could reach the bottom alive." Raphael closed his eyes as if to shut out a vision of the awful scene, the precipice, and the victim dashed over it. "Not time for a single Ave or Paternoster," said the bandit, "even had he had the grace to repeat one, but I trow that you had made half a heretic of him. There was not a saint who would help him in his need, or he would not have come to so awful an end." Raphael turned and rushed into the cave, to hide himself from the sunshine and give vent in solitude and darkness to the first burst of uncontrollable grief. I, said Marco, following him with his eyes, "if ever one brother loved another, that brother was Raphael. He is always teaching and preaching about submission, but I take it that when it comes to a sharp, sudden trial like this, the heretic's faith and trust will be whirled away, like that poor struggling wretch who has just been dashed to pieces over the fall. It was an awful sight, even to one used like myself to rough work," added the bandit, wiping his brow, "and often when I stand sentry within sound of that deathly cataract, I shall fancy that I hear again the last cry of the miserable Enrico." "Is Matteo returning soon?" asked Horace, who could not forget his own perilous position even in his interest in the fate of the sufferer. "He will come when he has done his business," was the surly reply. The sun has nearly sunk behind the hills, but the expected party have not yet appeared. The band will keep on the watch and perhaps pass the night in the woods. I am appointed sentinel at the rock pass till they return, and I have come to fill my wallet and my flask, as it is uncertain how many hours I may have to remain and keep guard." So saying, the robber went to the entrance to the cave, pushed aside the plants which almost concealed it, and stooping his tall, gaunt figure, entered in. Horace felt an almost irresistible impulse to try once more the descent of the rocks, impossible as he had found it to be to climb down while the shackles confined his ankles. He was almost bewildered by what he heard, evil tidings succeeding evil tidings with a rapidity which had overpowered for a time the stronger nature of Raphael, disciplined as it had been by conflict and suffering. Horace attempted to pray, but could not collect his thoughts. Only the only words of Scripture that came into his mind were, "Oh, that I had wings like dove," and that aspiration the poor doomed captive uttered from the depth of his soul. In about a quarter of an hour Marco emerged from the cave and proceeded towards his allotted post. He stopped as he was about to pass Horace and looked at him with a scrutinizing eye. "One might deem that you had been the one to lose a brother," he observed, "or that you had just seen the ghost of Enrico. You look white as a corpse on the bier." Horace made no answer, and the robber went on his way. Scarcely had Marco reached the wood when Raphael came forth from the cave. He was now perfectly calm, but almost stern in his sadness, and Horace saw more distinctly than he had ever seen it before the Rosignol's likeness to his brother. Raphael made a gesture to the prisoner to place his foot upon a large stone which was near, and then, to the surprise of Horace, threw himself on his knees beside him. "When I besought God to make the path plain before me, I thought not of this answer," said Raphael in a low tone, "but just and true are his ways." And the moment after, with a file which he had brought in his hand, he was working at the chain of the captive. The mingled feelings of hope, fear, delight, impatience, which struggled together in the bosom of Horace past description. Thought Raphael filed with the full power of his right arm. It seemed to Horace as though the stubborn iron would never give way, and the noise caused by the instrument sounded to him so loud that he was in terror lest it should reach Marco and awake his suspicions. At the first pause made by Raphael, though it was but to shake back the dark locks that had fallen over his brow as he stooped, Horace caught the file from his hand and used it himself with the desperate energy of one who felt that his life might be the sacrifice of even a few minutes' delay. But he found that better progress was made when he resigned it again to Raphael. Not a single word was uttered by either until the work was completed, and Horace stood unfettered beneath the deep blue sky, which was already darkening into night. He would have leaped and bounded in the rapture of recovered freedom, but for an instinctive delicacy which forbade demonstration of joy in the presence of the bereaved brother of Enrico. "Now, "Put on my mantle and hat," said Raphael. "Why so?" asked Horace. "Surely we shall escape together. I shall have your guidance through the forest. Through the most intricate part you shall have it, but when we reach the post guarded by Marco, we must separate. It is only wrapped in disguise that you will be able to pass him. He is but one man. There are two of us," began Horace, all his natural courage rising at the prospect of a struggle. "One man, but with two pistols at his belt, and with a hand that, when it draws a trigger, never fails to hit its mark. Remember also that the sound of a shot would be sufficient to draw the whole band upon us. Do not delay putting on this disguise. Time is precious to you now." Horace promptly obeyed. Though he had not yet attained the stature of Raphael, the difference between their heights was not great enough to be striking, and the almost sudden darkness of southern latitudes was now falling upon earth. "There is the moon," observed Horace. "Her light will serve to guide us on our way." "I need it not," the Rossignol replied. "Every step of that way is familiar to me," and he began descending the rocks. Horace followed, rejoicing in his newly restored powers of activity, though their exercise was cramped not a little by the necessity of moving with caution in the darkness. Before he clambered over the rocky parapet, he turned one last glance towards the old oak, the dim outline of whose branches he faintly could trace. "Farewell," thought the released captive, "farewell forever to the place where I suffered so much of evil and learned so much of good, where I have seen more of the wickedness of man and more of the grace of God in a few days than in all my former lifetime." In profound silence, save when a pebble fell, dislodged beneath a climbing foot or hand, the twain descended those rocks down which the prisoner had so often gazed, measuring their depth with an anxious and at length a hopeless eye. A few more steps, and the fugitives had entered the depths of the forest. Here the light was almost entirely shut out, for rarely was a glimpse of the silver moon seen behind the thick branches. Over moss-grown roots, between the knotted, gnarled trunks of old trees, now bending low to avoid being struck by their boughs, now thrusting aside plants whose long trailing tresses concealed all trace of a path even during the day, Raphael guided his companion. Occasionally there was a rustle as they started some wild creature from its lair, or a frightened bird rose on the wing. A single nightingale was pouring forth its soft, melancholy lay. Other sounds there were none, till a faint noise, as of a distant waterfall, reached the listening ear. A sudden turn at length brought the fugitives to a break in the forest, and Horace saw before him the same ledge of rock overhanging a precipice, which he so well recollected traversing under the guidance of Enrico. The moon, almost at the full, in unveiling brightness shone on the cold gray stone, veined with green moss and lichen, and the wooded heights which rose on one side above it, and even revealed the awful beauty of the deep gorge on the left, glimmering on a stream which, hundreds of feet below, wound like a thread of silver through the dark valley. Distinct in the moonshine, which threw his black shadow on the rock wall behind him, rose the gaunt form of Marco the bandit. He stood at so narrow a part of the ledge that though he was almost close to the rock, the precipice in front of him yawned scarcely more than a yard from his feet. He could hardly be passed without being touched, and Horace perceived at once that, without the protection of a disguise, the attempt to cross in front of the watchful sentinel must bring inevitable destruction. "Draw your hat lower over your brow," whispered Raphael. "The password is Speranza. If Marco speak to you, do not reply. Silence on my part would cause no surprise after all that has passed. The sound of water will be sufficient to guide you till you reach the bank of the stream. Do not attempt to cross it." Raphael's voice faltered as he spoke. "Turn to the right and follow its course till you reach the high road, which crosses it by a bridge. And now, God's blessing go with you." And extending his hand to Horace, Raphael added, "Here we must part." "Oh, Raphael," exclaimed the young Englishman, grasping it with emotion, "I cannot desert you thus. I cannot leave you to the vengeance of Matteo. I feel that your blood would be on my head. I would rather go back to the cave." The two hands were yet clasped in each other, and Horace felt the warm pressure of his friends as he replied, "You would have no chance of mercy. Your young life would be the certain sacrifice. I have 1,000 advantages which you do not possess. I know every man in the band. I have put most of them under obligation. Every path in the forest is familiar to me as well by night as by day. If you knew the mountain's weight, which will be removed from my heart by your flight, you would not dally thus with your fate. But do I not leave you to danger, the most terrible danger? You leave me to the care of my heavenly Father. He is with me. I have nothing to fear." "But," began Horace, still retaining his hold of the hand of Raphael, "if you should suffer for this generous act, I never should know peace any more." "Say not so," murmured the Rossignol, with more than his usual sweetness of tone. "If anything should happen to me, think that the lone, desolate wanderer has found at last rest and a home, that the dreary warfare is ended, the long life struggle over. I am not, as you are, a mother's hope and pride and comfort. I now stand alone in the world." "I will be your brother," exclaimed Horace. "Oh, I cannot, will not desert you." "You could not serve me, even were you to return to the cave," said Raphael. "I could not replace the chains. The Rubicon was passed when I filed them asunder. My chance of escape would be greatly lessened by my having to care for your safety as well as my own. Therefore go, my friend, my brother." Raphael drew Horace to his heart and pressed him to it for a moment in a close embrace. Then suddenly unloosing it, he turned around and buried himself in the wood. Chapter 16. A perilous pass. The parting from Raphael gave a keen pang to Horace. He could scarcely have believed that in so short a space of time any human being could have obtained so strong a hold upon his affections. Pity, gratitude, admiration had combined in a threefold cord to knit to his heart the man whose fate had been so singularly linked with his own, and who was now freely risking life to save him. But Horace had no time to dwell on tender recollections at a moment like this. The absorbing instinct of self-preservation claimed now the first place in his mind. Every minute of delay increased the danger of the dreaded Mateo's return. Horace must pass along that perilous ledge, close in front of the ruffian whose strong arm could, were his slightest suspicion aroused, hurl the stripling over the beetling precipice to lie a mangled corpse in the valley below. Speranza, speranza, hope. Horace repeated to himself, less from the fear that in the excitement of the moment the password might escape his memory, than from an effort to draw encouragement from the sound. God be my helper. God be my hope. And drawing Raphael's mantle yet more closely round his form, and pulling the hat lower over his eyes, with a palpitating heart, yet a firm, brave step, Horace Cleveland strode forth into the moonlight, which had never before appeared to him so painfully brilliant. Ha, Raphael, you are not going thither. It is of no avail. You will only turn your brain altogether, exclaimed Marco, as Horace approached him, and to the no small alarm of the fugitive, the bandit actually laid a strong, heavy hand on his shoulder. Speranza, muttered Horace, shaking himself loose from a grasp which seemed to him like that of death. The fugitive could scarcely believe the evidence of his own senses when he found himself actually striding onwards beyond the perilous spot. He expected every moment to be overtaken by a bullet or to hear a sudden shout of recognition. He dared not look behind him, nor much quicken his steps, but instinctively he held his breath till he had gained the wood at the further end of the ledge. Then, indeed, a low, fervent thanksgiving burst from the lips of Horace, and he felt himself really free. The sound of falling water had every minute become more and more distinct. Horace, with eager hope, hurried forward in the direction from whence it came. Yet a little struggling through bramble and bush, trying the most direct way rather than the clearest, while still listening with painful anxiety for sound of pursuit, and the youth reached the bank of a stream which was rushing on as if eager to plunge madly down into the valley. The trunk of a tree lay over it, cutting with its dark, rough outline the path of quivering silver which the moonbeams had thrown across the waters. Here must have been the scene of the fearful catastrophe which Marco had related. Horace shuddered at the sight of those dark, rapid waters in which a fellow creature so lately had perished. He had now, however, no time for reflecting on the untimely fate of the wretched Enrico. Remembering the directions of Raphael, Horace was about to track the upward course of the stream when he was startled by a faint cry as of a human voice, which mingled with the rushing noise of the cataract. Horace was not of a superstitious nature, but it is no marvel that, when his nerves were quivering from the tension required for a great effort, at that hour of night, in that desolate place, on the very spot where he believed that, but a few hours before, a miserable man had been swept into eternity, that cry should seem to curdle the blood in his veins. Again it rose, more distinct than before, and now superstition, if such a feeling had for a moment arisen, gave place to one more worthy. Horace was many yards from the head of the cataract, though he could see its spray white in the moonlight. The way to it was very thickly overgrown with brushwood, through which mortal foot had never yet made its way. He held a short debate in his mind as to the course which he ought to pursue, whether he should seek his own safety by going to the right, or whether he should force a difficult passage to the top of the fall, in hopes of giving aid to some fellow creature in distress. Was it not possible that Enrico, saved by some incomprehensible miracle, might be there in a position of peril from which he had no power to extricate himself? Might not Horace give aid to the brother of Raphael? That last thought destroyed every doubt, every selfish calculation of personal risk. Horace only considered how he might reach the place, and though not yet daring to answer the cry, he began with all the activity and energy on which he once had prided himself to make his way to the edge of the cascata. When the English youth had accomplished his object, how wondrous was the scene which presented itself to his view as he bent forward to gaze down the cascade. The body of water was not large, but the depth of the fall was very great, and one sheet of white foam overspread the stream which plunged seething, hissing, roaring, down, 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 till it was lost in the cloud of spray which, hundreds of feet below, veiled the bottom of the cataract. Exquisite was the beauty of the fall, especially as now seen by the misty, silvery light of the moon, which gave a ghastly grandeur to the wild, bold, wooded rocks, which the cataract seemed to be cleaving asunder, like an archangel's glittering sword. But the eye of Horace was riveted on one dark object in the midst of the foam, not many feet below the summit. At the first glance, he deemed that it might be a fragment of rock that had endured for ages the dash and fret of the restless waters. But no, it moved, it clung, a human being, suspended as it seemed by miracle, was living, breathing in the very heart of the dizzying roar and rush. "How can I help you?" shouted out Horace, forgetful of everything but the frightful situation of Enrico. "A rope! Quick! My strength is giving way." Hollow and strange came the scarcely articulate sounds. Horace struck his brow with his hand. "What can I do? Oh, what can I do? A rope were worth the ransom of a king. I can't hold out long. The rush will bear me down." The voice was fainter than before. Horace drew Raphael's mantle from his shoulders. He tore from it strip after strip. He could think of no other means of saving the perishing man. With fingers which trembled with nervous haste, he proceeded to tie together these unmanageable substitutes for a rope. Tightly, he knotted them and tried each knot, for the awful consequences, were a single one to give way, were too terrible to think of. His movements were quickened by the horrible dread that he would see Enrico, exhausted and despairing, whirled down to certain death at the very moment when deliverance appeared at hand. "Haste, or I'm lost," cried the voice from the fall. Horace was engaged in fastening one end of his improvised rope round a tree which bent over the cataract. The stem was so slender that he almost feared lest its roots should give way with the strain which would be upon it, but there was no other tree sufficiently close to the edge to serve his purpose. "Now," exclaimed Horace, as he flung the thick knotted rope towards the spot where the indistinctly seen form of Enrico broke the long line of foam. At that moment a cloud passed over the moon, which had till then been shining in untroubled brightness. "Where is it? I can't find it," cried Enrico in a tone of anguish. Horace's interest rose to agony. He had done all that he could do. He had strained every nerve. He had now nothing left but the means of prayer. Fervently, he prayed for light on the fearful, the fatal darkness. Like a film, the cloud rolled away. He looked down, almost fearing to look. Enrico was still clinging below. "I see it, but I can't reach it," shrieked the miserable man. The dark line of the rope lay on the foam just beyond his outstretched hand. Horace was almost in despair. He had no power to throw it nearer. The current of the waters was gradually drawing the life rope further away from their victim. "Make a spring at it," exclaimed Horace, and shuddered at his own words, lest Enrico should obey, miss the rope, and be dashed to pieces down the fall. "He has done it." "Oh, merciful heaven," gasped the youth, almost faint with extreme excitement. Hold on for your life." And with a strength beyond his years, a strength which seemed to be superhuman, Horace, throwing his whole weight on the upper end of the rope, drew it hand over hand towards him. He was in momentary dread of feeling it suddenly become light from the yielding of a knot, or from the numbed hands below giving up their desperate grasp. He was not without an undefined sense of terror lest he should be overbalanced himself, and instead of saving Enrico, be dashed with him over the abyss. Not even when Horace had passed Marco in safety had he experienced a feeling of relief so intense as when Enrico's dripping head appeared above the fall, and, a moment after, with a tremendous effort, he swung himself on the bank. "Thank God! Oh, thank God!" exclaimed Horace. Enrico lay motionless, senseless. His failing powers had been concentrated on that one effort, and he swooned as soon as it had been made. Horace did all that he could to fan the flickering spark of life. He first dragged Enrico a few paces from the edge, for in that moment of dizzy horror, he could not disconnect nearness to the Cascata della Morte from the idea of danger. He longed to get beyond hearing of its roar. He then removed part of the clothes of the half-drowned man, which were torn, saturated, and dripping with water. He chafed Enrico's limbs, breathed on his lips, tried to impart warmth to the bruised and benumbed frame. He wrung the water from the long black hair which hung in tangled strands over the ghastly face, which even in its senselessness retained a look of distress which told of the agony of the late struggle for life. While Horace is thus engaged, I will relate how Enrico had come into the strange and fearful position from which he had been thus wonderfully rescued. Slipping on the rough tree bridge and losing his balance, Enrico had fallen into the stream, struggling in vain with the current, and had been, as Marco had described, borne onward to the edge of the cataract. In vain had he attempted to catch at the reeds of grasses near. In vain he had shrieked for help. He had been whirled on, and then over in that awful plunge which involved almost inevitable destruction. From the center of the rock wall that backed the cataract, and not very far from the summit, jutted out small fragment of crag, round and over which the furious waters had for centuries dashed, bearing away articles of the solid stone by ceaseless wear, yet leaving a tooth-like projection, only visible when the flood was not full, though its opposition always whirled the spray in wider circles from that spot. On this projection the unfortunate Enrico was dashed, stunned, and bruised. Caught by his clothes, he had been suspended for some minutes in an almost unconscious state, unable even to utter a cry. He revived, indeed, but only to become aware of the full horrors of his situation. His eyes being, from his position, turned below, he beheld the awful depth down which he expected every moment to be hurled, as the fierce hissing waters, with unceasing flow, seemed like merciless enemies determined to tear him down, to wrench him away from the one little point of refuge afforded by the projecting crag to which he now wildly clung. Enrico's soul sickened, his brain reeled. The din of the torrent rushing, rolling, roaring, above, below, almost maddened the wretched man. A strange idea possessed his mind, that it was Raphael's prayer which suspended him now, as it were, by a hair above the gulf of not only temporal but eternal destruction. If Raphael should cease, even for a moment, to pray, the half-frenzied Enrico believed that the waters would have their wild will and bear him crashing down to perdition, swathed in the white shroud of their foam. Thus passed the fearful time till brief twilight deepened into night. Still Enrico clung to his crag, its shape enabling him so to support his person that its weight did not rest on his hands, though all their strength was needed to enable him to resist the constant pressure of the furious waters. He was contending with a foe that could never grow weary. Often Enrico cried aloud for help, with a bitter consciousness of the improbability that such cry would reach a human ear, since he had never yet known anyone come to the top of the cliff, less from the difficulty of reaching it than from a superstition which clothed the Cascata della Morte with supernatural terrors. The forest path, indeed, was not far distant, but it was lonely and wild, and never trodden save by members of the band. It seemed to Enrico as if the din which perpetually roared in his ears completely drowned the sound of his voice. He could hardly hear it himself. How could it reach a distant ear? The robber had become calmer, though not less wretched. His mind now reverted to the past. Each event of his life, every error, every sin, seemed to rise up before him distinct as the white spray in the moonlight, hissed in his ears with the roar of the fall. Had not his position for years been imaged by his position now? Carried away by his passions as by the flood, hurled over the brink of crime in full rapid career towards endless ruin, yet caught, suspended, restrained, as it were, by the prayers, entreaties, example of one who remained amid the whirl, the rack, and the rush, yet unshaken and firm as the crag. In that hour of extremest peril, the sinner's cry arose to his God. Raphael had spoken of mercy. Might not that mercy be extended even unto him, not perhaps to save him from impending death, but from the more fearful death of the soul? Words that his brother had read from the scriptures flashed back on the mind of Enrico. He is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him. The drowning soul clung to that truth, even as the numbed hands clung to the rock. Enrico knew the utter impossibility now of saving himself. He felt that he deserved no mercy from an offended God, but there was one who could save to the uttermost, one who had died to save, one who could draw him yet out of the horrible pit and set his feet on a rock and order his goings. While thus hanging, as it were, between earth and heaven, Enrico heard the call of Horus. He doubted not for a moment that the Almighty had sent his brother to his aid. When the rope of knotted strips was thrown down the cascade, it seemed to the poor penitent as an emblem of heavenly hope. Then sudden darkness hid it from his view, and in vain his hand groped in the chill waters to find it. The gloom of despair seemed to settle on his soul. The cloud rolled away, and the straining eyes of Enrico beheld the rope once again. He sought to grasp it and failed. Was it that mercy, even the mercy held out to all contrite sinners, was not to be reached by him, that he who for so long had tried the patience of a long-suffering God was to perish at last even in sight of the means of salvation? Raphael is praying, and I will hope, thought the struggling sufferer, and when Horus shouted down the direction to spring, Raphael bids me, I obey, was the reflection which nerved him for the one desperate leap upon which he staked his existence. Even when the rope was grasped, so great was the sufferer's exhaustion, so benumbed and stiffened were his fingers by the drenching of the flood, that he could scarcely retain his hold. Yet it was as though an angel whispered as he was dragged upwards through the dash and the foam, hold fast the hope set before you." It was not merely the action of a drowning man grasping a cord, but of a perishing soul clinging to its last hope of grace. As soon as the fearful effort was crowned with success, exhausted nature gave way. In a stupor which must have had fatal consequences had it overwhelmed him 2 minutes earlier, Enrico lay, with his dripping head supported on the knee of Horace Cleveland. The stupor continued for some time. At length the pale lips parted, and sounds came forth. Horace bent down to listen, and caught the words, "Oh, Raphael, I knew it was your prayer." Then the large black eyes suddenly opened. They rested not on Horace, but looked wildly around, as if seeking some other face, and half raising himself on his arm, Enrico exclaimed, "Where is he? Where is my brother?" Horace did not answer, for at that instant his attention was arrested by the sound of a distant report. He sprang to his feet. There came another, then the rattling sound of a volley, all in the direction of the high road. "Ha!" exclaimed Horace Cleveland. The hunters lay in wait for a deer, but they seemed to have fallen in with a lion. Then, for the first time, Enrico recognized his deliverer. "The prisoner and free," he exclaimed in accents of alarm. Free as the air, and not likely to be soon in bondage again, if that sound of musketry, as I believe, tells that soldiers are at hand." Enrico struggled to his feet, passed his hand across his brow, and listened with a look of bewilderment and fear. Enrico, you also are free, free from worse bondage than mine. Remember that the robbers will deem your life forfeited. Surrender yourself up to justice, and I pledge my honor that every effort shall be made to secure your safety and your pardon. Pardon. Enrico repeated the word, clasped his hands, and looked upwards. He was not thinking of the pardon of man. Chapter 17. One effort more. We will now return to Raphael, who with keen and breathless interest had watched from the shade of the forest Horace's passage along the perilous ledge. When Marco's hand had been laid on the shoulder of the youth, the Rossignol could hardly refrain from springing forward to the rescue, and scarcely had Horace himself experienced greater satisfaction than did his friend when that startling danger was past. When the fugitive had disappeared from his view, Raphael, for the first time, appeared to have leisure to think of himself. To aid in the escape of a prisoner was, as he well knew, a crime to be atoned for only with life. Raphael was young, and notwithstanding the recent bereavement, which had been like the wrenching away of a heartstring, life was to Raphael a precious thing, not to be parted with lightly. As he stood with folded arms under the waving boughs, a sense of the loveliness of nature came on his poet soul with a soothing, softening power. He felt loath to leave God's beautiful world. How divinely fair looked the scene before him, beneath the silvery rays of the moon. How wooingly breathed the night breeze upon his feverish brow. How sweet sounded the nightingale's song, warbled soft through the stilly air. Hope, even earthly hope, was not dead in that young bosom. There was still a desire for human love and for human happiness there. Raphael thought of Horace, blessed with friends, a mother, a home, not, indeed, with envy, but with the instinctive yearning of a tender and loving nature for the sympathy of human hearts, of which he had known so little. Thus the improvisatore had no intention of awaiting a violent death with folded hands. He revolved all possible means of escape. From Matteo's mercy, he expected as little as he would have done from that of a lioness whose cubs had been slaughtered before her eyes. He must not await the burst of frantic fury of a father bereaved of his son and balked of his vengeance. Nor could Raphael count upon the protection of any of the band, though he knew that on some he had the claim of gratitude. No, he must rely upon the aid of God and his own efforts alone. Raphael resolved to wait just long enough to give Horace a fair start, which might be essential to his safety, and then to follow himself in the same track as that which his friend had pursued. It was true that Marco must be passed on the perilous rock, that the bandit had pistols in his belt, and that his bullet always leveled his victim. But Raphael deemed it possible that the man would be reluctant to slay a comrade, alone and unarmed. Marco was savage, ignorant, blinded by superstition, a fanatic who regarded murder itself as a venial offense compared with heresy, but he was not so utterly hardened and depraved as were Matteo and Beppo. The fate of Enrico had seemed somewhat to move even his rugged nature. At all events, Raphael felt that of two dangers the lesser one was to be chosen. Better to try the chance of passing Marco than to await the return of Matteo and his gang. After recommending himself to the protection of his heavenly Father, in submission to the divine will, whatever that will might appoint, the young Italian quitted the shrouding shade, and with a firm step advanced towards the sentinel, whose eyes were at that moment turned in an opposite direction. Raphael had, as we have seen, divested himself both of hat and mantle. His face was calm, but very pale, the expression that of a man who knows that he is facing death, but who has nerved himself to face it without flinching. The mass of rich dark hair thrown back from his high, pale forehead fell almost to his shoulders, damp with the dews of night. Marco was repeating an Ave for the soul of the miserable Enrico when, chancing to turn round, he suddenly beheld the tall figure approaching him in the moonlight, bareheaded, in its spirit-like stillness and calmness, with the gaze of its large, thoughtful eyes riveted on his own. It came along the path by which, not an hour before, he believed that Raphael had passed. The Rossignol marveled to see the fear which he was wrestling down in his own heart suddenly transferred to the man before him. Marco's eyes dilated, his lips parted, his very hair seemed to rise from his head. He crossed himself with a trembling hand, moved backwards step by step as Raphael Goldoni drew nearer, but staring at him still, like the hare fascinated by the gaze of the serpent. At last with a cry, Il suo spirito. It is his ghost. The strong man actually turned and fled, overpowered by superstitious terrors. Then Raphael knew the cause of that before inexplicable alarm which his presence had inspired, and with thankfulness for the path thus cleared for him which he could never have reckoned, came a bitter pang of remembrance, as he thought on his brother, loved and lost. There appeared to be as little cause to doubt the death of Enrico as there would have been had he been dashed over the falls of Niagara. No human foresight could have calculated upon the singular accident to which he owed his almost miraculous preservation. Scarcely had the Rossignol entered the wood on the further side of the pass, with a feeling of deep melancholy as he approached the scene of his brother's fall, when he was startled, as Horace had been, by the sound of distant firing. It was evident that Matteo and his ruffian band had lighted on no despicable foe, that they were engaged in a desperate struggle with those who would claim blood for blood and life for life. Raphael and Horace little guessed that a timid, delicate woman, foiled in her efforts to save her son in one way, had attempted another, with the energy given by desperation to maternal love. There had been a carriage and a lady within it. There had been postilions and outriders. The appearance of the equipage had been such as to awake cupidity, but not arouse alarm. But the banditti were soon to find out that the hands which held bridles were such as had been accustomed to grasp the sword. The luggage on the carriage consisted of sabers and carbines, and the travelers within it, save one, were soldiers chosen for courage and strength. Gold had, indeed, been lavished with unsparing hand by the almost despairing mother, and now, notwithstanding constitutional nervousness and delicacy of frame, Mrs. Cleveland risked her own life amidst clashing steel and flying bullets in order to lure from their secret fastness and draw within reach of the arm of justice those who in perilous captivity held her only son. What was the result of the conflict we shall hear in the following chapter. Chapter 18. Victory. Onward, onward. Now or never must we make a struggle for freedom, exclaimed Horace. If your strength fail you, Enrico, lean upon me. This is no time for giving way to weariness, and as for hesitation and doubt, the firing has ceased, gasped Enrico. We know not who are the victors. The right has conquered, be sure of that, cried Horace, whose countenance, beaming with hope and flushed with excitement, presented a strong contrast to that of Enrico, livid even to ghastliness. The young bandit in his dripping garments looked more like the corpse of a drowned man than one through whose veins the warm blood of life was coursing. Come on, again exclaimed the impatient youth, and almost dragging his companion forward, Horace hurried on for a few paces and suddenly confronted Matteo. Defeat, disaster, despair were stamped on the dark lineaments of the chieftain, distinct as the blood marks on face and hand. It was the wounded lion driven back into the shelter of his native jungle, who hears behind him the bay of the bloodhounds, the shout of the hunters on his track. Matteo had seen all his followers, save Marco, slain or taken, and then, not till then, had he dashed aside opposing weapons and plunged into the depths of the thicket. He had paused but once, and that was to reload a pistol, less to provide for defense than to assure himself that he should never fall alive into the hands of his foes. Before this desperate man stood his prisoner, his Italian companion at his side. No thought of apparitions roused in Matteo's superstitious dread. He doubted not that in mortal flesh and blood he beheld a traitor and an escaping hostage, a hostage for the son of whose ignominious death he on that very night had heard. A fierce joy flashed in the bloodshot eyes of the bandit. He had lost all beside, but a dying man's vengeance yet might be his. Matteo leveled his pistol and fired. The report rang sharp through the wood. A victim lay stretched on the ground, but that victim was not Horace Cleveland. Raphael had reached the spot at that crisis only in time to throw himself in front of his friend and receive in his own bosom the bullet destined for another. With a wild cry, Enrico rushed forward and threw himself on the ground by his brother. Absorbed by one overpowering dread, the wretched young man was unconscious of all that was passing around him. He heard not, cared not for the desperate struggle of Matteo with the soldiers, his wrestling for liberty and life as a wild beast caught in the toils, nor knew that the struggle ended at last in the capture of the chief. Enrico heard not, cared not for the sobs of delight with which a mother embraced a rescued son, nor knew the deep sympathy with which both Mrs. Cleveland and Horace now bent over Raphael. Had an earthquake shaken the forest, Enrico would scarcely have felt it. His brother's head was supported on his breast. The expression of the features was serene and painless, the heavy eyelids closed, and the long dark lashes resting on the colorless cheek. Raphael, my brother, look at me, speak to me. This is not, it cannot be death. One word, if it be of reproach. One look, were it even in anger. Tell me that I have not this night been rescued from the jaws of death, that I have not been saved from the whelming waters to be plunged in darker depths of wretchedness." The young man sobbed aloud in the anguish of his soul. His nerves had been completely unstrung by the events of the last few hours. His mind was crushed by the consciousness that it had been his guilt that had led to the ruin of his brother. "He bleeds but little. He will revive," exclaimed Horace. "I will bring water." And he hurried away towards the stream. Briny drops were fast falling on the face of Raphael, but they seemed to have no power to arouse him. "O God, have mercy upon me. O God, spare my brother. Let him not perish through my sin. I will submit to thy will in all things. I will not murmur. I will not rebel. Only spare this one precious life." It was the wrestling, agonizing prayer bursting from a broken and contrite heart. "See, his lips move," exclaimed Horace, who had just sprinkled water over the face of the dying man. Faint sounds came forth, soft and melodious still, from those tuneful lips so soon to be silenced in death. Even Enrico hushed his wild grief to listen. Low but distinct were the words. "Joy cometh in the morning. See, it is brightening in the east. Darkness is passing away, and forever." "Raphael, do you know me?" faltered Horace, as he knelt beside the rossignol and pressed his icy hand in his own. Raphael did not answer the question. The spirit fluttering on the confines of a world of light seemed already to feel the eternal sunshine on its wings. The large dark eyes slowly unclosed, but their gaze was fixed upwards, as if they beheld the vision of glories hidden from mortal eyes. "It is over," he murmured. "All is over. The struggle, the battle is past. More than conqueror, through him, only through him who loved me. Ah, Marino, thou art there to welcome me, the palm in thy hand, the glory round thy brow. I knew our parting would not be for long. See the angel faces bending from the clouds. They are waiting there to receive me. Light is streaming from the golden gate. Oh, stay me not, I must go. He must not die and leave me," gasped Enrico. "Raphael, live, if it be but to guide me, to teach me how to wrestle with my sins, to lead me, even me, to the Savior." Raphael turned his eyes upon his brother with a sudden look of joyful recognition. "Enrico, saved," he exclaimed. "Yes, saved from destruction of body and soul, saved to be. My joy and crown of rejoicing," cried the dying man, the radiance of unearthly rapture lighting up his fading features. "Oh, my God, I thank thee, I bless thee. Thou hast given me my heart's desire. Thou hast heard my prayer for my brother. Hark," he exclaimed suddenly. "Do you not hear the shouts, the music, louder? It is the song of triumph. The angels are beckoning me upwards. Why cannot I rise and join them? He is there, my leader, my king. I have waited for him, sought him. I have found him. All the mists are dissolving. The clouds are melting into light. The chain that bound me to the earth is loosening. He holds out a crown of life, and I take it, to cast at his feet. Horace covered his eyes. The martyr spirit had spread its pinions and soared upwards, leaving a track of light behind. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. A full pardon for Enrico was ere long procured from the King of Naples. It was granted partly on account of the services of his father, partly because of the earnest pleadings of the Clevelands, who thus sought to repay some portion of the deep debt which they owed his brother. The death of Raphael Goldoni had affected more than his life, more abiding influence upon them when they thought of him as one of the starry host, raised to glitter forever in the cloudless heaven above. Raphael had longed to win souls to Christ, and had sought them at the greatest personal risk, in the darkest haunt of evil. For such is the crown reserved, for such is the promise given. They that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars for ever and ever.